Rockstar is rich. Yes, I decided to kick in open doors today. Whether you're playing visual novels all day, live in a household without Wi-Fi, or are incapable of thinking because you're a goldfish, everybody knows about the success of Grand Theft Auto 5. And how could you not? The game is the second best-selling game of all time and generated $1 billion in revenue in 2020 alone, 7 years after its release. I'm not too big on Grand Theft Auto 5 for various reasons, but to many, this is the pinnacle of Grand Theft Auto, the creme de la creme. Now, my opinion on this game doesn't change the fact that Grand Theft Auto 5 has been in the spotlight for 8 years and continues to shine up until this day. But what many, and especially the younger generation, seem to forget is that Grand Theft Auto 5's pathway was paved for it by its predecessors on the PlayStation 2, and it would be nowhere near as successful without them. Vice City, San Andreas, Vice City Stories, they're all PlayStation 2 classics, and...
Aren't you forgetting something?
Right. Liberty City Stories is also pretty alright.
What is wrong with this guy?
Grand Theft Auto 3, or as I'd like to call it, the brother of the family that walked, so the others could run. When I think of the Grand Theft Auto entries on the PlayStation 2, I can't help but think of them as a group of brothers. One of them is a successful entrepreneur, the other a successful lawyer, the third one a top-notch doctor, and the fourth one a Nobel Prize winning scientist. And then there is Grand Theft Auto 3, the brother that ended up working a minimum wage job at a grocery store, but he is the smartest of all of them. He taught the others the basics of what they currently know, and whenever they have a problem to solve, they come to him. Without him, they wouldn't have come close to succeeding. Grand Theft Auto 3 isn't a good game. In fact, I'd say it's the worst PlayStation 2 entry and a very forgettable game at its core. But it is by far the most important one. Grand Theft Auto 3 isn't the first open world game, and it most certainly isn't the first Grand Theft Auto, as the 3 might possibly indicate. In fact, the first two Grand Theft Auto games were open world games. Grand Theft Auto 1 and Grand Theft Auto 2 had already been developed and released by Rockstar, called DMA Design at the time, in respectively 1997 and 1999. They were released on the PlayStation 1, PC, Sega Dreamcast, and eventually got a Game Boy Color release when the handheld hit the market in 1998. These games were actually moderately successful and experimented with the concept of open world years before Grand Theft Auto 3 would hit the market. However, these games had one obvious flaw, if you can even call it a flaw. They were two-dimensional. Now look, I'll be the last one to say there aren't any good 2D games, but when it comes to drawing the player in and making them feel like they're a guest in an existing world rather than the world existing around them, 2D just has a hard time getting that feeling across. With Grand Theft Auto 3, Rockstar wanted to create this living, breathing world that spoke for itself through things such as street signs, billboards, radio hosts, and its citizens. Their goal was to take all the freedom and diversity of the top-down games and essentially make it feel alive. A living, breathing world in which you can do anything. The day is Wednesday, October 3rd, 2001. You set your alarm at 6 AM because today is the day. Grand Theft Auto 3 is finally here. Except, it wasn't. Grand Theft Auto 3 was set to release on October 3rd, 2001. However, there was a little something that happened on the 11th of September. A little something so impactful that the release date had to be pushed back until October 22nd. It was the day Jay-Z released Blueprint.
Hahaha, now that's a good one!
Jokes aside, 9/11 couldn't have come at a worse time for Grand Theft Auto 3. With the game taking place in a New York-inspired city, some would argue releasing a game where you murder anyone at will isn't the most sensitive thing to do. But not only that, the fact that the game takes place in a fictional version of New York City meant they had to make some adjustments to the game to detach it from the awful events that occurred on 9/11. Rumors suggest that the game had undergone dramatic alterations, but Rockstar executive Dan Houser was quick to debunk all of them. According to him, most of the changes were as minor as cutting a few lines of pedestrian dialogue and things such as the talk radio. This didn't mean there weren't any notable changes though. In order to distance the game from New York City, the US gamebox cover was redesigned, the cop cars were recolored to not resemble the NYPD too much, the flight of a plane was altered so it didn't look like it was flying into a skyscraper, and last but not least, they removed a mission that referenced terrorism. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Back in the day, people believe Rockstar cut an entire stand of missions because data miners found references in the game's code to a character called Darkel, but according to Houser, he had been cut literal months prior to the events on 9/11, and his missions never came close to completion. The alterations to the game were in fact so minor that Houser stated the real reason for delaying the game by 3 weeks was the fact that Rockstar's office in New York was relatively close to ground zero, and the upset, overwhelmed mood in the office made it impossible to work for a brief period of time. When the dust had settled, however, they felt like they were incredibly close to finishing Grand Theft Auto 3, and that it was their duty to finish and release it. And thus, on October 22nd, the world got presented a game that would change video games forever. To me, Grand Theft Auto 3 is nothing short of a technological miracle. And with this, I'm not just aiming at every single one of its game-changing features, but more so the fact that the team was able to build it at all. Just 2 years prior, Grand Theft Auto 3 was this relatively stale 2D game with garbage graphics and dysfunctional gameplay, only for Grand Theft Auto 3 to release 2 years later. Motion capture cutscenes, professional voice actors, solid car physics, a bigger draw distance than ever seen before in a 3D game, an immense amount of radio channels, a functional day-night cycle, solid traffic simulation, etc, etc. All of it operating in a 3D world. Look, I'm not claiming to be a video game connoisseur, but to me this is the biggest evolution of a franchise of all time. Not only did they have to reinvent and develop literally everything for a whole new dimension, but they also had to drastically change its core concepts to not make the game feel as stale and boring. And all of that in a time span of 2 years. It's literally mind-blowing to me. And just think of how much of a drastic change in production this must have been for Rockstar as well. Auditioning, casting and directing voice actors, designing 3D models, designing, animating and directing hours of 3D cutscenes, and even direct and experiment for hours upon hours with motion capture technology, which was actually relatively new at the time. And yes, these models were actually motion captured. I know that looks like they're about to have a seizure, but that's just because of the technological restraints at the time. It was 2001, okay? They couldn't really do much more than this. Either way, the production process changed entirely, and so did Rockstar's team. From a small team that was using well-established technology to a big-ass squad using experimental technology. Rockstar took a huge risk with this massive transition that could have easily gone wrong, but instead ended up producing one of the most influential games of all time. Now, don't get me wrong, I've been somewhat praising Grand Theft Auto 3 so far, but I'm well aware of its shortcomings when looked at through a modern day scope. However, I don't think Grand Theft Auto 3 aged as badly as people say it did. The game opens with a semi-spectacular cutscene. The protagonist, later named Claude by the fanbase and confirmed by Rockstar, is robbing a bank together with his accomplice Catalina. However, the game turns out to be rigged from the start. Catalina betrays him without any hesitation and shoots him just outside the bank, leaving him for dead.
Sorry, babe. I'm an ambitious girl. You're just small time.
While being transported to prison, the van gets attacked by a bunch of gangsters who are busting their boss out of jail. You and a guy named 8-Ball use this opportunity to escape, but
My hands are all messed up, so you better drive, brother.
it was here, at this moment, with this guy having diapers for hands, that a foundation was created for what would eventually make Rockstar billions of dollars a year. From here on out, you start your journey as an underground mobster. Drugs, murders, hookers, all that good stuff. You start the game as everybody's bitch, but as the game progresses, you'll steadily move up in the chain of command. This truly is something Rockstar has always been particularly good at. Moving up in the chain of command takes time, and you can always feel a sense of progression in every aspect of the game. You start by doing basic bitch missions on a ghetto vibe island called Portland with garbage ass cars and little to no weapons available. As the game progresses, you'll slowly move up to the top of the food chain. You'll unlock newer, wealthier islands in Staunton and Shoreside Vale, are able to drive the fastest and most expensive cars and shoot the deadliest of weapons. Restricting the player like this is a formula Rockstar has held on to up until Grand Theft Auto 5, and it does a fantastic job of making the player feel the whole quote-unquote from nothing to everything story the game is trying to tell. You don't just unlock newer and better tools for the increasingly more difficult jobs, the people you meet and the environments you play through are a visual representation of this rise to success as well. People start treating you with respect, the game takes place in wealthier places, and you'll have everything you'll ever need at your disposal. And yet, it still feels like the game fails to properly reward you for reaching the very top. Throughout the game you'll unlock expensive cars, better, more damage-dealing weapons, and a bunch of painfully slow boats that function like absolute dick. Not only couldn't they be arsed or weren't able to develop Claude's ability to swim, which obviously isn't a good thing in a boat, but getting in the boats is glitchy as hell too. Whenever you try to jump in or out of a boat, the game decides Claude's legs don't properly work anymore, and it seems like you're more often than not limp-dicking your jump. Having numerous people ask how to exit the boat without dying on the internet isn't exactly a good thing. Boat rent aside, there just aren't that many rewards, and like I just illustrated, even the existing ones aren't perfect. Rockstar's shtick throughout these many years of Grand Theft Auto has been rewarding the player with crazier tools to cause chaos than the previous ones, and this game sadly just fails to deliver. There aren't any helicopters, motorcycles, houses or fancy planes to obtain aside from the highly dysfunctional dodo you're not supposed to fly. You'll just get to drive around in a regular Banshee. The game rewards you with so much money that you can wipe your ass with it after taking a number 2, but you got nothing to spend it on. After 48 minutes of gameplay, full cutscenes included, I had $58,000 and all I was able to purchase was pistol ammo for $250. But can I really blame Rockstar for any of this? Of course not. They made a huge transition from 2D to 3D in just 2 years and added an incredible amount of new, fresh ideas to basically deliver an entirely new entity to the world of video games. Who am I to complain about the lack of airplanes and helicopters to mess around with 20 years later? Well, maybe I'm an entitled little shit. Maybe I don't know anything about video games. Maybe I should just acknowledge the fact that designing those things and implementing them would have been a really difficult task at the time. But I can't help but feel lost when I'm not on a mission. I don't know what to do, how to entertain myself with nothing but the limited amount of tools I got. And that's just something I have never experienced in any of the other PS2 entries. But when you're actually on a mission, the game truly is a fun and enjoyable experience that is definitely worth the €3 I spent on it. The missions aren't as fun or diverse as the later entries in the series, but the ideas presented here are still very much present in every game up until Grand Theft Auto 5. Car chases, assassinations, drug wars, the missions in Grand Theft Auto 3 are the very foundation for the better, more creative missions in later installments. That being said, if you thought games holding your hand too much was a thing of recent years, think again. Grand Theft Auto 3 is just as linear and restrictive as any game in 2021. However, I have never actually seen this as a problem, nor did I feel bothered by this at all during my playthrough for this video. Rockstar believes in a bigger role for the storyline at the cost of creative freedom, and I think that's actually perfectly fine. Every mission is like a test in school. You write down the correct answer you were taught in the syllabus, and any other plausible solution will not be accepted. You perform Action X the way Rockstar intended to, and if you attempt to use your brain to come up with different solutions, you are instantly punished. Even getting out of the intended car for a certain mission will make the game yell at you. Hey, get back in the vehicle! No. You're an actor that does his own stunts in the story the game is trying to tell. And even though it comes at a cost of creative problem solving, I do not think there's anything inherently wrong with these missions. Well, aside from the fact that the game doesn't tell you what to do like half of the time, and you just sit there waiting for any cue that'll never come. For real, for a game that's supposed to tell you what to do and restrict you in your creative freedom, it sure as hell does a bad job at telling you what to do. In this mission, I had to drive an ice cream truck onto the terrain and blow it up. I did what the game wanted me to do, the man I was supposed to alert came outside, and I just sat there. And sat there some more, afraid to touch anything because that would potentially fail the mission for not following the rules. After 5 minutes, I was just about done and I decided to just murder them, which turned out to be what I was meant to do from the get-go. A bunch of missions suffer from the same issue. You just sit there and pray to God anything you'll do won't fail the mission. Luckily I barely ended up having to do missions again because of this, but for a game that fails the missions if you fart a little too loud, it sure as hell does a poor job telling you what the wrong or right way is. However, this is far from the biggest problem I have with these missions. The main problem lies in the game's mechanics used to complete them. Back in 2001, Grand Theft Auto 3 was praised for its mechanics and controls, both in vehicles and on foot. But as my boat rant might indicate, these have aged rather poorly. In Grand Theft Auto 3 you'll spend most of your time inside of a vehicle, driving from point A to point B. In 2001 the people were content with its functional driving controls that are fairly easy to master, and each car has its own unique feel, both in speed and handling. But in hindsight, it's not hard to see the vehicle's incredibly frustrating problems. Opposed to later installments, the cars are made out of cardboard and blow up relatively fast. But that was really the least of my problems during these missions. The worst issue these vehicles have is their ability to deal with the environment. Anything you bump into will drastically affect the trajectory of your car, and half of the time I felt like I wasn't in control of my vehicle because of this. Look, I get that bumping into stuff hinders a car, but bumping into a streetlight shouldn't have the effect of being hit by a fucking missile. This inability to deal with the environment drastically changes the role these vehicles play in the missions. In this mission, I was being used as a ping pong ball by several trucks without any control whatsoever. In this mission, the car I was driving was stuck on the smallest ledge of all time and unable to back up while being assaulted by rival cars, and I failed this race mission because the car drove over a pebble and flipped upside down. God, the cars in this game flip so fucking often, it's incredibly infuriating. And then I haven't even mentioned you can only get out of a vehicle once it has fully stopped moving. So if you slide for a little too long while your car is burning, you're just dead, and there's nothing you can do about it. My point is, due to the inability to properly deal with the environment, the vehicle's roles went from aiding you in a mission to being one of your worst enemies. But it's not like the on-foot controls are much better. Claude kind of moves like a robot and can even do small things like jump over the smallest of walls without doing the stanky leg animation. You'll just have to walk around for whatever you're trying to obtain on the other side, climbing over a ledge or anything like that just doesn't exist in Grand Theft Auto 3. Now, while manual camera movement isn't actually a problem in vehicles, you're unable to freely move the camera as well when you're on foot. And this is just incredibly awkward when you're in a gunfight and you're getting shot from the back. You can only move the camera like this in a first-person view, and you feel really disoriented when the game goes back to third person. Speaking of gunfights, you'll be able to lock onto enemies, but these controls are just as clunky as the rest of the controls. Enemies, civilians and dead bodies aren't differentiated by it, leading to many shootouts where you're shooting anybody but the intended target. Sure, you can free aim with the assault and sniper rifles, but free aiming with a controller is the single hardest thing to do in any Grand Theft Auto game, so you'll be stuck with the suboptimal auto aim. Now, this mostly applies to the PlayStation 2 version, because the PC version actually attempted to fix it. On the PC version, you can put your controls on standard or on classic, but both of them come with a catch. If you put your controls on standard, you will in fact be able to manually move the camera in third person, but you will have to aim manually as well. If you then put your controls on classic, you get the first person disoriented camera bullshit, but you do actually get the much needed auto aim. Now for me, a video game connoisseur that enjoys playing with a controller, this fixes, let me think. Nothing. I either get to pick between being unable to aim or not being able to manually move my camera, making for many awkward situations. Sure, I can put the controls on standard and play with my keyboard and mouse in order to easily main manually, but why am I being forced to do that? What kind of nonsense is this? Back when I played this as a kid, these controls and mechanics didn't bother me. At the time, this was the standard. But now, 20 years later, both the vehicles and the on-foot controls just frustrate me. They're so suboptimal and so much worse than what games provide nowadays. The quality these days just turns you into a spoiled brat. At the time, this was the pinnacle of gaming, the creme de la creme, and now it just makes me want to throw my controller at the wall after wasting more and more time failing missions because of the aforementioned problems. But even though these issues are very persistent throughout the entire game, the missions remain very playable, and most importantly, they remain moderately fun as well. But while revisiting this game, I just kept asking myself the same question. Why? Why am I doing any of this? Like I said earlier, Rockstar's success formula is emphasizing the story at the cost of creative freedom, which I'm perfectly content with. It's a trade-off that has resulted in some of my favorite video game stories. Watching your best friend become your enemy in Vice City, witnessing Ryder's and Big Smoke's betrayal in San Andreas, those storylines were incredibly engaging from start to finish. Grand Theft Auto 3's storyline, however, isn't very good. In fact, I find it very difficult to see any of this as a coherent storyline. Many hold this storyline in high regard, but I think this is mostly fueled by nostalgia. The whole idea behind the game's story is Claude's intentions to work his way up in order to get revenge on Catalina, but the game never does anything with this concept. The people you work for don't care.
Go and take care of things for me.
There aren't any plans made or connections acquired in order to get this revenge. It just sorta happens. In Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, CJ arrives at his home on Grove Street, Los Santos, with nothing left. The Grove Street gang is down in the dumps, and CJ is being used as a puppet by the corrupt cops Tenpenny and Pulaski. Throughout the game, you'll slowly bring Grove back to greatness by fixing one problem at a time. Acquire new businesses and connections in order to establish yourself as a top dog, and eventually get rid of the corrupt cops that are pretty much ruling the streets. It's a sick fucking story with great characters and solid plot development that makes sense from start to finish. It's a prime example of how to properly write a Grand Theft Auto story. In Grand Theft Auto 3, there is no such thing as real plot development. You just do random jobs for a random boss that you'll eventually end up killing for various reasons, and you move on to the next. Rinse and repeat. At its core, the story is interesting enough, but compared to later entries, the writing lacks in tying the story together, and major plot twists are dealt with quite poorly without leaving any real impact. It feels like Claude is nothing more than a performing monkey in this story, blindly following every single order he gets. And it doesn't just feel like this because of the lackluster writing. It's more so because he is. Claude is a silent protagonist that has no opinion on anything. He just does as he's told. Now, I'm not here to complain about silent protagonists being a bad thing. I made 2 videos praising games where nobody says a single word at all. Games like first-person shooters, The Stanley Parable, Dishonored, they all have silent protagonists. But the difference between these games and Grand Theft Auto 3 is that the concept of having a silent protagonist actually works. And it does so for two reasons. The first one is pretty obvious. The games I listed are all in first person. There isn't a character on screen all the time, you are looking through the eyes of the character. You are the character. Grand Theft Auto 3, however, is played in third person. Well, aside from when you have to move the camera like this, because free camera movement doesn't exist. In Grand Theft Auto 3 you constantly have a person on the screen that doesn't have a voice, a personality, or a brain. Now, this still doesn't have to be an issue. Last year I talked about Journey, a beautiful exploration type game that blew my mind with its environmental storytelling and gorgeous visuals. This game, just like Grand Theft Auto 3, is also in third person. But why does this work in Journey and not in Grand Theft Auto 3? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. The story of Journey isn't about the character you play as. The story is about traveling through this gorgeous world, uncovering the mysteries behind the old ruins. You are the guest in this world, a guest in a story that's being told by ancient ruins and cool-looking penguin dudes. The story isn't about you, but about what this world once was. Now, let's head back to Grand Theft Auto 3. Grand Theft Auto 3's story is all about getting revenge on Catalina, the woman that stabbed you in your back during the bank heist. Grand Theft Auto 3's story revolves around Claude. He isn't a guest in a story, the story revolves around him. The story revolves around a character that was created to be nothing more than a necessary mechanic. And that just doesn't work. What does Claude think about his actions and everything that's happening around him throughout the entire game? How does he feel about murdering the people he used to work for? What are his opinions on getting a condom stuck to your face? I need to know. God damn it! Sorry, kinda lost my cool there. Instead of any of that, you get a government-controlled AI that will in fact slice his fiancée, his sister and his cat in half if some dude he met 25 seconds ago asks him to. And what all of this results in is the sheer fact that I don't care. I do not care about anything that happens in Grand Theft Auto 3. The people you do missions for are incredibly forgettable and treat Claude like the performing monkey he's supposed to be, the missions feel incredibly detached from one another, and the protagonist is a non-existent character. What am I supposed to even care about? I felt so incredibly detached from the story that I more so booted up the game to play a series of minigames rather than progressing the story, and that just isn't what a game like this is supposed to be. A game like Grand Theft Auto doesn't need to have the best story, most of them are just over-the-top depictions of real life anyway. But the least it can do is make me give a shit about the events that occur. Make me want to find out what happens next instead of just having me eliminate some random fucking dude. Grand Theft Auto 3 just repeatedly fails at doing just that, and it's not hard to see why this game is so difficult to revisit for some. And I just can't help but feel like this could have easily been avoided by just giving Claude a voice.
I smoke cause it gives me knowledge.
Look, it's really easy to talk shit on Grand Theft Auto 3, because the game was never going to be good. It was made back when dinosaurs still roamed the earth, for crying out loud. You think Kendrick Lamar's first music sounded good? It probably sounded like dragging your nails across a chalkboard. Nobody had ever tried a crime sandbox 3D open world like this, and with the tools available in 2001, it would have been never able to meet today's standards. But Rockstar set out to do one thing with this title: to create a living, breathing world. Did they at least succeed at creating just that? Yeah, I'd say so. From the very first area in Portland to the very last area in Shoreside Vale, the buildings, sidewalks and streets are carefully detailed to give each area its own personality and tell its own story. Some would say that the grainy-ass colors of everything ruin the atmosphere, but I think these grainy-ass graphics add to depicting the parodied shithole of modern-day America Rockstar was going for. The pedestrians inside of these areas perfectly fit this idea as well. They are these complex characters with somewhat distinguishable faces, outfits, and most importantly, personality. Throughout the game you'll just see citizens strolling from building to building, stopping for a second when you pass by to utter some dumb fucking sentence like
Oh, you look like my daughter.
or screaming like little girls when you lose control over your car for like the millionth time. If a train passes by, the music you're listening to is drowned out. In certain areas, gangs will shoot your car at any given time. You'll hear sirens from police cars or ambulances at random. The world just feels alive. Hell, even the radio adds to this feeling. Commercials comment on the ridiculousness of modern day life, and on the talk station they do things such as normalize child labor as a parody on modern day issues.
Excuse me, sir. Do you enjoy your job here?
It's fun. We get to play with knives.
I see. Is there a real sense of teamwork?
My friend Joey sewed his hands together.
Wow, you're learning some real skills. How about the salary and benefits?
Yesterday, I made $1.
See, that's the kind of dedication we have to our employees and the quality of our shoes. Eris running shoes. Always running from something.
Grand Theft Auto 3's world isn't perfect, and certainly isn't the most living, breathing world I have ever seen. But for a 2001 game, it did a solid job that holds up relatively well today. It wasn't the first ever open world game, but it showed what the PS2 hardware was capable of, and it revolutionized the genre. Open world games is the dominant genre in the modern day video game world, and Grand Theft Auto 3 could be considered its founder. But now, after 20 years, that's all it really is. A foundation. Grand Theft Auto 3 isn't good. There are far too little fun and diverse vehicles, and the ones that do exist have some of the worst handling I've ever seen. The on-foot controls are suboptimal, there's no map aside from this small ass mini-map, so you'll get lost all the time. The story is about as interesting as watching paint dry, and with a silent protagonist, there just isn't a whole lot to care about. And yet, the game still has its charm to it. While revisiting this game for this video, I had nothing but a good time. Something about the 2001 crust is just so appealing to me. I love the clunky on-foot controls that make shootouts a living hell. I love getting smacked around in vehicles without any control. I love the crusty cutscenes with the worst audio leveling of all time.
You are new in Liberty, but already you are gaining a reputation on the streets.
The game doesn't feel coherent, but the missions are fun as hell. Even though the mission ideas don't go any further than shoot a person, blow up a car, or retrieve a person from jail, the missions all feel unique and memorable. And the same goes for the radio as well. The songs are a mishmash of cheap songs from the public domain, the soundtrack to Scarface, and a bunch of in-house produced songs. They don't reach Vice City or San Andreas levels of good, but they're enjoyable and really grow on you after a while. Listening to these enjoyable tracks while driving through the grim atmosphere of Liberty City, with its identity being shaped by the street signs, billboards and pedestrians, is more than enough for me to enjoy my time playing. But my subjective opinion on the game doesn't mean it's good. I enjoy playing Grand Theft Auto 3 in 2021, even with all of its shortcomings. To me, it is most certainly a game to come back to. It most certainly isn't as unplayable as a huge chunk of the internet says it is, but objectively, it isn't a good game. The thing is, Grand Theft Auto 3 was always going to suck, because it was made in 2001. Technology wasn't advanced enough, budgets weren't big enough. The limitations of its time make up for pretty much all of the issues I listed in this video. Besides, they literally jumped from 2D to 3D in a time span of 2 years and delivered a game-changing product that would spawn imitators for years to come, all trying to be the best crime sandbox. While making this video, I didn't want to criticize the game for what it is unable to do, because at the time and considering its limitations, this game is just incredibly impressive. It feels unfair to shit-talk it through a modern-day scope, but sadly 2001's ceiling is somewhere below the belt compared to today's standards. We all start somewhere, and so did 3D Grand Theft Auto. They utilized everything that was available to them at the time and delivered a living, breathing crime sandbox that still feels very playable in 2021, despite all of its limitations. And in the end, that's all I could really ask from a 20-year-old game.